Intro and then we'll. Hi, this is Anne and Ursula from Be Above Leadership. Welcome to our YouTube channel, Coaching 101. Today we're going to start a series that we're calling Challenging Topics in Coaching. And we're going to focus on metaphor today and looking at using metaphor in coaching. So if you like us, go ahead, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel because we're going to continue on with this series. So hi, Ursula. How are you today?
Do you want a metaphor of how I am today?
Yeah, sure. Oh my gosh. So what challenging topics in coaching? And we're starting with this idea of metaphor.
Yeah.
So, in coaching school, right, we were told like use metaphors. It's on the little checklist. You get a little tick box if you use a metaphor. Ursula, what makes this challenging for some of our clients?
Well, I find there's two things that are challenging. Sometimes, when I ask a client, what would be a metaphor for which you are feeling or where you are, whatever it might be, it really is literally a blank. They have no connection to what it means or what it could be. So that's one part. And then there are the clients who simply don't believe that it's relevant to have a metaphor for it.
Right. That's what I was going to say. There's the clients who kind of are like, yeah, I don't really do metaphors. I don't really, that's not there for me. So, you come out of coaching school ready to just go for it with metaphor, and then the client is not wanting or maybe able to go there. So let's talk a little bit about what may be going on in the brain from our understanding of the brain, both in terms of why it might be difficult and why it also might be important. So
yes.
What are some of the things that are happening in the brain when we use metaphor?
Well, the way the right and left hemisphere, so that's where I'm going with this, the way the right and left hemisphere see the world is very different. So the right hemisphere, for example, can process information through metaphors and images and the bigger picture. And the left hemisphere can't. The left hemisphere sees the world far more specific and far more narrow and far more literal. So
Absolutely. And let me just build on that. What I would say is that they have a very different relationship with metaphor. And so if I can just tweak it a little bit, I would say the left hemisphere for the most part is not as activated, especially if the metaphor is unusual. You've never heard it before. You're going to get more right hemisphere activation, kind of activity, novelty perking up in this very interesting right hemisphere that, as you say, is like seeing the big picture like that.
Well, and I want to build on that because it really, I think the more unusual the metaphor, the more challenged some of our clients will be because when you think about this as a, giraffe or a pink tree or whatever it might be, it can be really hard to make that connection.
Yeah. Or to come up with it yourself, to sort of say, I'm going to now go into this part of my brain. And part of it, to go back to right and left hemisphere, we do know that for the most part, everything we do, we're going to get firing on both sides of the brain. There's some question in terms of the research about, people being left-brained or right-brained, but we also know because of a process called neuroplasticity, which many folks are familiar with, that we develop tuning, stronger alignment when we use something a lot, and less alignment and even pruning when we don't use it as much. And so if you're not someone who has been rewarded and has had, gotten A's in school for using metaphor, which might be the case if you're in creative writing or art or things like that, where metaphor is part of the world that you're working in. If you're someone who's had your rewards and your focus be much more about things being very explicit, then you may not have as much as many of your neurons on alert and ready to fire when a coach says, hey, you're feeling kind of down today. What's a metaphor for that? Whereas if, you ask a creative writer that, where their neurons are ready to go, they've been tuned up, you might get a really good a pink tree metaphor.
Yeah, no, I can totally identify with this in regards to neuroplasticity, because I remember a client from many, many years ago who, when I asked that question, what would be a metaphor for that, literally said to me, I don't do metaphors. She was a delightful woman running a very successful small accounting company, and this was not her world. And so I
Well,
had
you don't want to have a lot of metaphors in accounting. You
no,
want to know that this line lands up, adds up with this line. You don't want it to be like, well, Ursula, your budget is a little bit like a ship sailing the sea. Like, you don't really want your accountant to say that.
oh, I would love an accountant like that, but only because I know you and I love metaphors. It would not work in the regular world. But what was interesting was that once we started sort of dabbling a little bit in metaphors, like in a very gentle and slow way, over time, that neuroplasticity for her really got wired in a lot stronger. And literally years later, she started writing poetry, and like metaphors became her go-to thing.
Right. She kind of activated, the potential of these neural pathways and then tuned them by using them. And so I think this is a great story because it shows, and we've got a couple of little hacks that can help, I think, coaches with metaphor. And some of you may have already figured this out. We're not the final word on any of it. I want to say one other thing, though, about the value of metaphors. And we'll put this link in the description, but years ago, I wrote a blog post called Metaphors Are Lint Catchers for the Brain, which is a metaphor in and of itself. So there you go. Because I was thinking of cats, and I was thinking about when you take that tape roller thing and you like roll, you put it on your black pants that the white cat has sat on. Well, you pick that up, but you pick up lots of other stuff as well that you maybe didn't know was there. Mm-hmm. And I think this is often how metaphors work in the brain. They give you this kind of like they stabilize something so you can look at it and you go, okay, there's the white cat fur like I thought, but there's some other dirt and dust and what's going on. And I feel like they kind of freeze frame things for the client. So if it's, I feel like a pink tree, you've stabilized that emotion. And now you can sort of walk around the tree and see what else might be there that the client was not as fully aware of at first. So metaphors, I love this line from our dear friend Mandy Blake, who does work with somatics, and she talks about using what's going on in the body as a way to surface the invisibles. And I think metaphors are another wonderful way with the client to bring to the surface. And we're like, oh, yeah, I said a pink tree. And if you ask the client, what does pink mean to you? Wait a minute, maybe there's something there with pink that I was not even fully consciously aware of. Ursula, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's that the lint and the fluff that gets picked up and all the other things, as well as the deepening of something, a deepening of an emotion, a deepening of a situation. And I think the other value for me in regards to metaphors is a metaphor is an image as well. And so I find that when I use metaphor for myself, I get a little bit more of a sort of, I stand back from my emotion a little bit more. I stand back a little bit more from the situation. I'm not right in it. And it just helps me look at the situation in a clearer, bigger, and deeper way. And it's not quite as threatening.
Gives you more of that observer mind capacity, which we actually hold. We might even do a piece about the observer mind because it's such a critical aspect for coachability.
Yeah.
If a client is coachable, can they stand back and take a look at this? And I love what you're saying, that metaphor, whether it's a situation or an emotion or anything, can give us a little bit of that distance where we can kind of walk around it. And often it can inspire more creativity. And I want to share with you an example that we use in our program. And David Rock, this comes from David Rock, where he says, if I tell you to imagine, a small company battling a big company, okay, or, a small company trying to, I guess battling a big company, we'll just leave it there. You're kind of like, okay. But if I tell you, for most people, I want to talk a little bit about the exceptions in a minute. Most people, if I say, I want you to picture a mouse battling an elephant, all of a sudden, you've got a much different, for most of us, sort of, oh, how would a mouse battle an elephant? It's less conceptual. It gives you something where you could say, no, if we're the mouse, what are the strengths of a mouse that we could, can we poke the elephant? Can we run away from the, like, what can we do? And so in that way, it can really inspire creativity, I think, Ursula.
Oh, absolutely. I think people come up with solutions. I mean, the minute you say that, the PowerPoint slide in the program comes, to mind, this little mouse in its superhero costume with a little sword in the hand and this huge elephant. And it's really interesting. Students always say, well, flexibility, agility,
Yes.
surprise, and that comes all from a metaphor.
Right. And you might get there anyway if you do it without a metaphor. If you just say a little company battling a big company, you might get there anyway. But there's a way it comes in with more speed and more juice, I think, when you use the metaphor. So a couple of things. Not everyone, there's a certain percentage of folks who don't see pictures in their head. And so metaphor may be somewhat different for them. I want to say it's like between 3 and 4%, something like that. And there's a word for it that I cannot remember.
I think it's aphasia.
What is it?
Is it aphasia?
It might be. Yeah. I'm not sure.
I got that from you. And it's the one
So
thing I
maybe it's right.
remembered.
Okay.
It's the one thing I remember.
So you say the mouse battling an elephant, and they don't actually, the brain does not create a picture of a mouse battling an elephant.
Right.
And so there's that. There's also certain aspects on the autism spectrum where the brain may process much more literally, which can actually have strengths. To just like really be a very literal thinker, it has different strengths. And so we think about neurodivergence. I've started saying that even more than neurotypical, because it may not actually be bad that you have this ability to even be stronger in a more linear way, in a more, like completely analytical way of looking at something. But just for all of us to know, the ability, the way that metaphor works does not work with absolutely everyone, but it does work with most people. So I have a little tip for using metaphors, and then maybe we'll wrap up. So here's the tip. When you ask a client, so most clients, I don't tend to just directly say, what's a metaphor for how you're feeling today? Unless I know this is a client who just dances in that world. That's the world they live in. They've always got some image going on in their head. And those clients, we have a few of them, right? Yes. You just say like, what's a metaphor? And they'll tell you a metaphor. Like, how cool is that? For a lot of folks, what I will ask instead is I'll give them a category. Mm-hmm. So, and you can do this on a couple of layers. So the best category to live with, to give someone, like the example of your person that you were talking about, Ursula, is a category they're familiar with.
Yes, absolutely.
So, if this person liked to cook, for example, asking, this situation that you're in, what kind of dish are you cooking? Mm-hmm. Because that will help them narrow things down in their brain rather than put them in this place where they sort of go, wait a minute, what if I get it wrong? Nothing's coming to mind. It will immediately put them into context.
Yes. Yeah. And we all know our clients well enough to know what hobbies they have, what kind of things they really like. The other thing, and I really like this tip, the other thing is, the other funny thing that I find is that many clients, even though they say, I don't do metaphors, they already talk metaphorically. I mean, people
Yeah.
come up with metaphors all the time. They're just not aware of
I have
that.
the best example of that. This came from one of our students. She was trying to get a guy she was working with, to use metaphors. And he literally said to her, and he didn't say it ironically. He said, I don't do metaphors. I'm like a bull in a china shop with metaphors.
Oh, what a
You're like,
metaphor.
okay, then, yeah. So, yeah, so people, our language is seeded with metaphors. All languages are, and we teach this program around the world, and all of our students, China, Mexico, Costa Rica, France, Norway, everywhere that we go, people will talk about the metaphors, or even, sometimes it's an idiom from their language. It is part of language in general, and a lot of them are hidden underneath.
Yeah.
So the other thing I think with this tip with metaphors is you can ask about a hobby, if they like cars, if they're, what's the software program, all of that. And usually someone, even if they say I don't do metaphor, they can do metaphor if you give them a category.
Yes.
Or you can ask a really general category that everyone has relationship to. So sometimes, like in a check-in, I will ask people, or if I don't know the client very well, I'll just ask them what flavor of ice cream they are.
Yeah,
Or what color are
I
you
haven't
today?
met anybody yet that doesn't like ice cream. So that
Or
should
at least
be
doesn't know ice cream. I did this with a client the other day. I asked her what flavor of ice cream she was. She said, she thought for a minute, she said, I'm dirt ice cream today.
Oh,
But you know what? You know what? That was rich. And
yeah.
we went into her emotional and what was going on with her through this metaphor of dirt ice cream. And it was actually really interesting because it was about, it's dirty, but there's still some sweetness. And it really, it picked up a lot in that kind of lint catcher. It was really interesting.
Oh, I
So
love that. That is very, very sweet. That is very,
yeah.
very sweet.
So there's a little bit of metaphor and the brain, and stay tuned. Again, hit the subscribe and the like button. We really appreciate that. And more on challenging topics to come. Thanks, Ursula.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.